Hi everyone, FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos here, and this week we'll finish what we started last week, and that's a look at the last batch, or the latest batch, of viewer games, and a couple of viewer questions as well. So first we'll look at a couple of the games, and then we'll hit the questions. So it'll be a bit shorter this time, probably, although I think my analysis is maybe a bit deeper for some of the games than last week. So anyway, we'll see how long it goes. The first game was submitted by White, who was Flint Eastwood, or Josh Winterberg, I guess, in real life. And he writes this. He says, Hey Dennis, I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on this game. I'm White against a player 200 points higher rated in a 5-minute blitz game. I play the Albin Chittard attack in the French, and after a couple of inaccurate moves on my opponent's part, I found the opportunity to sacrifice 2 pieces for a winning attack, or at least I'm pretty sure it's winning. The reason I'm submitting it is because I'm quite sure that it shouldn't have been so easy. The 2 points I think he played bad moves were moves 11 and 12. At this point, would you say there was a chance he could have gotten an advantage? At move 11, I was expecting c4, after which I thought my position is cramped, but I have an open h-file to work with, and a strong center which will be hard for him to break up without creating uncomfortable light-squared weaknesses on the king side. At move 12, I was expecting knight takes e5, after which I thought the position would be extremely sharp and unclear after bishop to b5 check. Is my analysis correct that I could maintain at least equality if he had gone down these lines? Or if I made a mistake, either here or earlier, which he failed to capitalize on? Other than accepting the gambit, anyway. I don't usually play this line since 6h6 normally makes things pretty difficult for me. I guess the rook move seems a bit strange, but I figured bringing it into the action helps protect d4 as it did in the game, could provoke some weaknesses on the king side. But although it worked as intended in this game, I wouldn't be surprised if there was a way to refute it. I also know that 8 knight to h3 is the main line, and I wonder if there is a specific reason, or whether my plan of using it to take on d4 and helping to attack the light squares on the king side works as well. Thanks. Okay, well that was a lot of questions, and but that's good. So let's have a look-see at the game and figure out what's going on. So as advertised, it was the this gambit line against the French, against the in the classical system. And here, okay, he expressed some concern about h6 as a reason he doesn't usually play this. And I should say that this is probably not a very good system for black against it. And I'll just quote Sakis here in his book on this particular, well, this general branch of the French. So he says, don't concede weaknesses in an area where you're weak already. This general rule is 100% applicable to the present position. So, yeah, black is a little bit vulnerable on the king side, and h6 is just creating maybe some more targets over here. So the variation that he suggests against it goes like this, just to take and to play f4, so kind of like a regular classical with h6 and h4 interpolated. And he thinks that after a6, queen g4, f5, let's say takes, and queen g6 check, and then bishop to d3, as played in the game Velimirovich-Lontoch from the Nice Olympiad in 1974, slightly favors white. And indeed, there are a couple of games that have gone this way. White's won both. So it's not that black is losing, but h6 isn't really the key test by any means of the system. I mean, when white is playing h4, well, let's put it this way. Black's play is going to be on the queen side. I mean, he's going to try to, as always, or as almost always in the French, to break up the white center with c5 and go for play with knight c6 and so on, trying to attack on that side of the board and in the center. So a move like h6, I mean, it's hard to see how this could really be the critical test. So the moves that are maybe more important are, okay, classically a6 was the main line, preparing c5 without having to deal with knight to b5 in reply. Castles is a move that's become more popular lately. I think it's recommended in one of the recent French books. I'm trying to think which one. Yeah, I'm not sure, but I know it has been recommended, and it has become more popular. And also, of course, you can just take the pawn, which is what happened in the game. So takes twice. Now, here is Flint Eastwood mentioned. He knows that knight h3 is the main line, or at least it's classically the main line. Another move that's been popular is queen of d3. This was played by Kasparov, among others. And it simply hits the pawn on h7 straight away, prepares to castle queenside in some cases. Obviously, it's not legal right now. And the queen can also slide over to various squares, too. So this is not a bad approach. Anyway, let's address the issue of why knight to h3 rather than knight to f3. And the answer is quite simple. The knight doesn't do anything on f3, and it doesn't do anything on h3 either, but from h3, it can go to f4, where it does prove quite useful. So that's really the point. Okay, queen e7, and then the knight can come to f4, maybe queen g4 first, g6, and now knight f4. Sometimes knight to g5 too. And here the knight is quite well placed, with various sacrificial possibilities on g6, on d5, sometimes even on e6. Okay, we can maybe help boost some of the g6 tricks with bishop to d3. Whereas on f3, it really doesn't do anything. And okay, if you just want to play knight takes d4 after c5 and c takes d4, I mean, you could just play this without giving away a pawn first. So this, I think, is not really a very dangerous way to go. Now, white still has some compensation. I mean, you've got the open h-file, you're a tempo up on the usual variations, but it's not nearly as good. Plus, it blocks the queen, whereas the knight on h3, of course, doesn't. As I said, queen g4 becomes a possibility here. Okay, so knight f3, queen d8. Queen e7 makes more sense to me. The queen is useful here. It could come out to b4 in some positions. And it safeguards f7 and some other squares too, like e6 in case of some sacrifices there. So I just don't see any reason not to play queen e7. It's not a huge deal, but it's better than going all the way home. Okay, and now for white, queen to d2 makes more sense, I think. Very often, I would say, when white wants to try to attack on the king side in the French, it's quite difficult for him to do so without getting the queen involved. So queen d2 with the idea of queen f4, for instance, makes, I think, good sense to me. And, of course, it prepares castling queenside as well. Bishop to d3, on the other hand, I'm not as enthused about this move. I think the bishop just becomes a target after a quick c5. So you have to worry about c4 in some cases, not always, but sometimes. And more to the point, the knight's going to come to c5 either after d takes c5, knight c5, or if white does nothing, then c takes d4, and knight to c5 can be an option as well. So I think better to just kind of leave it, make the other constructive moves that you can first, and only then commit to bishop to d3. All right, here black played h6, but a6 with the typical idea of c5, again without permitting knight to b5, looks quite sensible to me. All right, h6. Okay, and now white played rook to h4. I like ideas like this in general, although I think maybe rook to h3 can be a little bit more sensible too, keeping the fourth rank clear for the rook and for the queen, pardon me, and making the rook a little bit less exposed. But maybe rook to h4 could be just as good here. But why not again queen to d2? So again, you prepare to castle long. The queen can come to f4, and again, I think white has some compensation here. Okay, so rook h4, c5, rook to g4, and here he was asking about the move c4. Well, it's playable, I suppose. To be honest, I actually didn't look too carefully at this because I think white generally is going to benefit more from the center being closed in such a situation. I mean, white's trying to attack on the king side, and I wonder, just speculating offhand, it's probably junk, but it's always at least worth taking a quick look at things like this. So bishop takes c4 and then knight to e4. Aiming to jump into d6. Probably this is baloney, as I said, but I'll at least entertain myself very briefly with a quick look at this. So queen to d2. Probably just king to h7 or king h8. Say castles queenside, knight c6, rook h1. All right, I'm trying to maybe cooperate a little bit here. So let's make a little bit less cooperative move. Well, no, that is cooperative because of f5. We have this check. And knight takes e6. So that's definitely not the way to go. If we're going to play f5, we should play it back here. So let's see, f5. All right, well now, what if we throw in the check anyway? So here, takes, knight takes, king g8, knight e6. Of course, white is giving up an awful lot of goodies here to get this. So white's got a queen and two pawns for a rook and three minor pieces. Usually this is not thought to be such a good material balance. Well, only down two, I guess. Maybe queen g5 and queen g4. All right, maybe some compensation. Anyway, something like this could be considered, although I suspect that this is something the computer will laugh heartily at if I flip it on. But all right, let's consider some more quiet approaches too. So you can just play bishop back to f1 or e2. Okay. Yeah, because the queen's not going to be able to jump through that diagonal. So bishop to f1. And alright, what does black do now? He's got to protect the pawn. So let's say maybe, well, now that there's no bishop involved, could play g6. Alright, but what if maybe b3? Maybe we can just undermine the pawn, bring the bishop back. If queen a5, no big deal. We play queen d2. We wanted to do that anyway. cb, cb. Okay, just being a little cooperative. Knight c6, bishop to d3. Yeah, probably black is okay here too, but alright. I mean, I don't know that black is, or white's any worse off here than he would be in some other subvariation. In fact, after knight to b5, he's got some counterplay. Alright, so again, that was a bit cooperative. Maybe black can play a6 here. And, okay, we can't quite get away with any tricks just yet. Maybe something like king f1. So that way there could be some knight takes d5 ideas somewhere. Not yet, but somewhere. Or rook to c1. Preparing queen f4. So, I don't know. It's interesting. Oh, also, yeah, no, okay, back to king f1. So king f1, and there is the idea of playing knight to b5 and knight to d6. So probably black would have to retreat the queen somewhere, or move his king to e7, but that looks a bit crazy. So, yeah, I mean, white has some compensation. I don't know that b3 is the only attempt either. You can also just play queen to d2, prepare to castle queenside, also playing queen f4 soon. So some chances. I mean, it's just a way to play, but it does take some of the pressure off. So king f8 I think is a reasonable move, just getting out of the way of knight to b5 in advance and protecting the pawn, of course. And what black played isn't so bad either. C takes d4. So in the game, knight to b5 was possible. Black can either play king f8 or knight c6. Alright, but knight takes d4 is what happened, and then here, if I recall, black asked about knight takes e5, and then wondered about bishop to b5 check. Well, I don't think bishop to b5 check is so good. I think you should just take on g7. If bishop to b5, you'll play king f8, I think. And I don't really see compensation for two pawns. So rook takes g7 is probably the best try, but still, I think black is okay. So knight b to c6, takes. Let's say queen d2, queen f6, rook g3, and then black could play a few moves. h5 is okay. Just getting the pawn to safety and preparing h4 to drive the white rook off of the g file. Even just knight takes d3. In both cases, I think black is all right. So he's up a pawn. White has some compensation, but black is pretty solid. His king is okay. He's got this nice wall of pawns, and as long as White's attack doesn't get too meaningful, and at this point I don't think it should, then I think black can look forward to the future with confidence, as they say. But in the game, black played g6, and this is just bad. And now white played very well. I think the sacrifice was absolutely accurate. Knight takes e6, so this is a very good move. And then the second sack is also excellent. So very nicely calculated, or good intuition, as the case may be. But it was very well done. So queen takes d5, and now black has, I think, only two moves that are really worth considering. The threats are queen f7 mate and queen to d6 mate, and the two moves that are, I think, worth considering each address one of the two checks. So there's queen to c7, which stops queen d6 and clears d8 for the king, and there's queen to g8, which stops the other check and again clears d8 for the king. I think they're both good for, well, white's better in both cases, but black survives at least the immediate catastrophe. So on queen to g8 we check and play e6, so we get the one piece back. White has three pawns still for the other piece. Well, make it two pawns, but again, after castling queenside, I mean, white's got two pawns, yeah, but more to the point, the black king is stuck in the center, white's pieces are all very active, so white has a nice advantage, but I don't know if it's a win, but it's certainly pretty pleasant. Alternatively, if queen c7, then queen f7 check, king d8, again e6, threading e7 mate, so we need another clearance move. And now e7, e8 anyway. And we can make a knight, comes to the same thing, but it's the most forceful way to do it. And again, white's clearly better. Material is slightly in white's favor with the rook and 2 pawns for 2 knights. But again, the more salient point is that white's pieces are all active. If the queens get traded, there's not really going to be much of an attack, but still, it's going to take black some time to disentangle over on the queen side, so white stands better. Still, black is in the game in both of those variations, which cannot be said after the catastrophically bad knight takes e5. So white, of course, just took, and now black is just dead. He can't go back to f8 because the rook hangs. He can't play king to d7 because of castle and queen side, if nothing else. And after bishop to e6, just queen g7 would be even better, giving black the same horrible options, or some of the same horrible options of king d6, castles, queenside, and so on. But bishop to f5 is certainly more than good enough. And after rook to e8, white just mates in 2 moves like this, and that's the game. So, very nice. I'm not sure that the particular opening variation is going to bust black in this gambit line, but after that, I mean, again, the 2 knight sacrifice was very nice, and certainly the play before that wasn't bad. I just think it's probably better to stick with knight h3 or queen to d3 back in this position. Okay, well, on to the next game, and this was from a simul. Our submittee, or the submitter, was George Hollins, as a Class B player. Played a pretty good game here. He lost this simul game to Nigel Short, but was winning at one point and certainly played interesting chess throughout. So let's have a look. He had black, and yeah, Short played this kind of goofy line that's become a little bit popular lately with this oopsing the bishop to b5 and then slipping it back to c4. And the idea is that in one of the main lines here with, let's say, bishop to c4 straight away, okay, we can play either e6 or knight c6. It's generally going to transpose. Let's say knight c6, castles. I would point out, ironically, white sometimes plays bishop to b5 here. But okay, castles, e6, d3, knight g to e7, let's say queen to e1, and now black sooner or later plays d5. Okay, first we get out of the way, f5, and now d5. Okay, so this is one of the main ways to play, although here probably g takes f5 is better. Anyway, be that as it may, or let's say bishop to b3. Okay, bishop to b3. Black can still play d5 here. All right, well, the thing is, with bishop to b5 check thrown in and then bishop to d7, if black plays exactly the same way, at the end of all of that, he's not going to have enough defenders of the pawn on d5. So that's the big trick that white has in mind by playing this bishop to b5 check first and only then retreating to c4. However, after knight c6, castles, knight f6, well, let's just stop here. In this position, the bishop being on d7 is not useless at all. So his queenside play is accelerated. Further, black has a pretty good move here that's I think is going to become more popular now, thanks to Anand's victory over Carlsen in the Amber tournament with knight to a5. So white has 3 options here, and the worst one is the one chosen by Carlsen, which was d3. So after this, knight takes c4, bishop takes c3, and bishop to c6. And at this point, white is positionally busted, and it's just a matter of going for tricks. And he almost survived. He almost managed to draw the game, but that was basically because Anand just got kind of careless towards the end. And, of course, the fact that Carlsen is a tremendous fighter. But positionally, he was just busted and lost, or at least clearly worse for most of the game, and in fact did go on to lose the game. So he had the one saving chance, which he missed, and Anand won. Okay, so d3 is really not the way to go. These tripled pawns in this position, followed by bishop c6, this is good for black. So the two more, let's say, well, certainly more common and probably better moves are either bishop to e2 or queen to e2. I'm not sure if anything else has been played, but certainly those are the noteworthy moves. Well, let's talk about each. If queen e2, then of course black can just grab the bishop pair and then maybe play knight to h6, preparing a castle and keeping f7 well protected. This is about equal. And another idea is knight f6, and on e5, knight h5. This is kind of a bit more speculative, but may also be playable for black. Both of these are suggestions from John Shaw on, or I should say, in the his analysis on chesspublishing.com. The other move is bishop to e2, and this was played in a game Mechia against Gelfand from Bermuda in 2005. There, Gelfand played knight f6, d4, takes. So here we have kind of a funny dragon, where it turns out that black is probably several tempi up, although the knight doesn't usually go to a5 in this sub-variation, but he got bishop to d7 in for free. White wasted a tempo with the bishop, going to c4 and then back to e2, or actually 2 tempi. And, well, okay, if we just look at it that way, we should just say that white has wasted 2 tempi with his bishop. And, yeah, so black is fine here, and indeed Gelfand went on to win. Of course, he was a stronger player than Mechia, so he could have won in any case, but it does seem that black is doing just fine here. Okay, well, back to the short Hollands game. Hollands played knight to f6, and this was played, I think, before the Carlsen-Anand game anyway. All right, well, here, short played d3, which is okay, but e5 seems to be more to the point, and I think it's one of the standard ideas in this line. Of course, I'm sure short knows about this idea, but maybe he just wanted to play a regular Grand Prix attack kind of setup. But after e5, the idea is that after takes, and knight to g4, white has this temporary piece sack. So bishop f7 and then e6 check. So if king takes, well, knight to g5 check, king to d6, knight to b5, and there's going to be a very quick mate there. If bishop takes e6, then knight to g5 is double check, followed by knight takes e6, followed by queen g4, followed by a catastrophe. So king e8 is probably the best move here. And then after this exchange, white should be a little bit more comfortable. The material is even, but black can't castle, and white maybe has some chances to control the light squares in the center. On the other hand, the black bishop on g7 is a very good piece. So if white is better, it's not much at this point. Still, I think this probably gives white more than d3 does. Okay, so castles, and here he played h3, which was a novelty. It's not a very common position, so it's not all that meaningful that that's a novelty. But the previously played move was queen to e1, which is pretty stereotyped. It's play queen h4, f5, bishop h6, and the usual Grand Prix attack stuff. So go ahead and show that for those of you who aren't super speedy on your chess notation. So that kind of thing is the idea, and then the knight goes to g5, and hack, and mate. At least that's the dream. So h3 prevents bishop to g4, and bishop takes f3 if nothing else. Okay, a6 is a good move. a4, and now a move that I think is not so good, b6. To me, this strikes me as at best a wasted move. I mean, white didn't play a4 because he's going to play a5. He played it to prevent black from playing b5. So black can do something else constructive. Could play knight to d4 as chosen in the game. I think just e6 would be quite a simple and good move. Preparing to fight for the d5 square and that pawn push, and also restricting f5. And here I think black is, if anything, at least equal, and probably a little bit, at least has the sunny side of equality. So b6 again, I think this is just a wasted move, and maybe even worse than wasted. I mean, perhaps there could be some positions where you play queen to b6. Anyway, after b6, short now plays queen to e1, and here maybe knight to b4 is a little bit better than knight to d4. So the same idea, we want to put pressure on c2, but we're avoiding the exchange. And also after bishop to b3, bishop to e6 is not a bad option. So continuing to put pressure against c2, and well, against d3 too, if black is allowed to play bishop takes b3. If the exchange happens, that's fine. Then white is going to have his chances of attacking on the king side go down, and the pawn is not really particularly weak. So knight to d4, I think, is another inaccuracy, and now white can start to hope for an advantage at this point. I should say that the pawn on b6 is yet again a detriment. Black could comfortably play queen to b6 here if it weren't there, but since it is, he can't. An interesting line at this point is d5. So we want to kill this bishop, and then b5. And if ab, then I think black could even be a little bit better. So bishop to a2 is best. Now queen to b6, defending the pawn. And the following line is just very, very speculative. f5, rook a to c8. Okay, so all of this is quite logical so far. And now d6. Okay, trying to pry open, well, not trying, succeeding in prying open the long diagonal. And now knight to f4, threatening knight takes g6. Well, it looks like black can play rook takes c2. So that's an introduction to some real complications. Knight takes g6. And now black can try a couple of bishop moves. I think one is probably better than the other. Bishop to c6 is certainly a nice idea, with the point that on knight takes e7 check, black can play queen takes e7, I think. Queen takes e7, rook takes g2 check, king h1. And now, I believe rook to e2 check should be just fine. Well, if he doesn't play queen to e4, then we just take the queen up a piece. So this looks pretty much forced. And after knight takes e4, again, I don't really see anything good for white. I mean, the threats to play knight to g3 check, followed by rook to g2 mate. Maybe there's some other cute mates too, but that's the simplest. And on de, bishop e4, king g1. Black must be winning many different ways. The simplest looks like this. And we just check. And we take this guy. And we take this. And obviously that's a catastrophe. Maybe there's even better, but that's certainly more than good enough. So knight takes e7, of course, can't be played. Bishop to d2 would be the right move, blocking the second rank. And after rook to e8, knight e5, bishop d5, and knight c4. White's probably a touch better. Material's equal, but white is really coordinated pretty nicely here. The rook on c2 might get stranded. And the black king is maybe a little bit unsafe. So nothing too serious, but enough for an edge for white. So instead of bishop c6, I think bishop takes d3 is best. After knight e7 check, king h8, queen h4 check, knight h7, rook f7. It all looks very aggressive, but after rook to e2, it seems somehow that black has enough compensation for the pawn. Certainly the position is very, very unclear. So it's a possible line. All right, well, in the game, black played e5, and I think now white should be better after queen h4. So just continuing the usual pile-up. Maybe bishop to e6 should be played here, and then takes, and bishop to g5. Well, this looks scary, but it doesn't win a piece because black has a resource. After bishop takes c4, if white plays d takes c4, then black can save the piece with d3. So the point being that if bishop f6, well, black just recaptures with the bishop, and if white recaptures with either the rook or the queen, then we can play d takes e2. And if the knight runs away, then queen to d4 check breaks the pin. And now the black knight moves somewhere. So white's a bit better here, but nothing catastrophic just yet. Another option here is instead of playing d takes c4, to play rook takes f6. White probably has an edge here too, but it's nothing too serious after h6. White must play rook takes g6, hg, rook takes g5. Let's say f6. And now, okay, rook takes g7 and d takes c4. And this position is a little bit better for white, I think. Not much, but a little bit. Material is about equal. White's got a knight and two pawns, although his pawn structure has its problems, in return for a rook. But the knight can come to f5 via g3, and then white's certainly in good shape. So white's a little bit better here too. All right, well, that's what would happen or could happen after queen h4. In the game, white played the kind of slow bishop to d2. Black played queen c7, bishop b3. Here, again, I think bishop to e6 is not a bad move, but b5 is okay. A takes b5, and now probably the best move is a takes b5. Opening the a file, I think, is good for black because, again, it prevents white from just focusing exclusively on the king side. So white will at least have to either cede the a file, may not be worth very much, but it's at least a small concession, or keep attention to it, but in that case not be able to devote all of his attention to hacking away over on the king side. So probably white's best here is bishop to b4, threatening f takes e5, and in reply white or black must either move the rook away, in which case he's losing a little bit of control over the f file, and f7 in particular, or he would need to play something like e takes f4, which is positionally a bit ugly. So white has an edge, but nothing too serious just yet. All right, black played bishop takes b5, and now probably rook to f3 is best, preparing just to load up on the f-file, and again play queen h4 sooner or later with a pretty pleasant advantage here. All right, instead he took, and again rook f3 wouldn't be bad, but he played queen h4, which is also quite natural and good. Here, black should probably play knight to e8. It's unpleasant to uncover the f-file, but it may be his best chance. So bishop to b4, knight to d6, say bishop to d5, maybe queen to g3, and then c3. So white is playing to exploit his bishops. I mean, it looks like white has the advantage of the two bishops. He doesn't. Both sides have all their bishops, but whites are so much more active that it kind of seems that way. Anyway, white is definitely better here, but black is still in the game. In the game, though, black played knight to d7, and now, had short played queen to e7, I think white's just winning here. So f7 is falling, and I don't really see any compensation for black in exchange for this pretty good pawn. So instead, short played bishop to b4, still better, but not as much better after knight to c5. And now short makes another mistake. He should preserve his very nice bishop with bishop to d5, but I guess he miscalculated something. So he played bishop c5, queen c5, and maybe initially he was thinking that he could play rook f7 or bishop f7, or he just thought that he would play rook f3 and then double on the f-file and simply overwhelm him there. Well, we'll see rook f3, which is the move in the game, in a moment, but let's first look at rook f7, which is equivalent to bishop takes f7 check. So takes, and then queen h7 with the threat of rook to f1, winning the piece. This is pretty dangerous, but it looks like black can survive with rook to f8, not fearing this this recapture. So queen takes g7, rook f1 check, king f1, and queen takes c2. And all right, white takes on g6, and we can even give him this pawn with check, but really black is just fine here. White's up 2 pawns, but the threat to the knight is very serious, and the d4 pawn is extremely strong. So if white just plays passively with something like queen to h5, black can play queen to e3 or queen takes e4 and start pushing the d pawn, and this is not pleasant for white at all. Really, he's best off just taking perpetual check here. And similarly, if he plays queen takes g6, really this just comes to the same thing. Rook f6, queen g7, takes, queen c2, and so on. So rook takes f7 or bishop f7 doesn't really achieve anything. And if rook f3, which is what happened in the game, black can defend with bishop to d7, as happened. Okay, now I should say that if instead of bishop to c4, white tried rook takes f7, it's even worse now. Here it's a failure because after rook f7, takes, queen h7, rook h8, rook f1, there's bishop to f5. And this is oops time for white. White probably has to play rook f5, and it's speculative at best. I mean, white gets 3 pawns for the rook. Shouldn't be enough. Okay, but short played bishop to c4, attacking the pawn, bishop to b5, and in here b3, and this is not a good move either. So Hollands took, and now played a5, and this is actually a very good pawn. So white's pressure against f7 really doesn't mean much. The a pawn is a dangerous passer, and further, after queen f2, bishop h6, now this bishop comes alive, and white is really in trouble at this point. So he played king h1, a4. Black is much better now. And after a few more moves, now if black had played a3, it looks like he's just winning. There really doesn't seem to be any serious counterplay for white at all. And meanwhile, this pawn is just going to run. It's going to go to a2, and then just needed a little bit of help. Maybe queen b6 and queen b2, or d takes c3, and then putting a piece on d4. White's busted here. But you got to break. So black played d takes c3, which looks subtractive, but it's the first step, on the way to disaster. Knight takes c3. Okay, now here if queen to d4, white can hold with queen to e1. the bishop needs to retreat, and black can, or white has time to regroup. He can maybe play rook a2 or something like that, or even just knight to d5 at this point, and he's okay. So black played bishop to d4, which looks extremely natural and just seems to be crushing at first sight. But short has this nice move, knight to d5. And the rook is immune. It's just mate and 2. Bishop takes a1. Let's give this a lot of question marks. Knight f6 check, king wherever, queen h7 mate. In the game, black played rook to a6, and this was also a blunder. Hopefully you guys all see why. Just rook takes a4. And the rook, because it had to protect against the knight f6 check threat, really wasn't protecting the pawn. So the game ended quickly, rook to d6, knight f6 anyway, takes, and down the exchange and a pawn with no real compensation, black resigned. However, he was still okay at this point. He wasn't winning anymore, but with f5, which is forced, and you should have seen this, but, late in the simul, you have less time to think. The guy's running around. You start getting nervous. You miss knight to d5. So it's easy to miss f5 in those kinds of circumstances. Anyway, this does hold the game, and in fact, short still has to find some moves to save it. So e takes f5 is the right way to go here. Okay, bishop takes a1, f takes g6, and okay, queen takes h7 mate is a threat. Black has to be careful. h6 is the right move here. So knight f6 check seems to be best, and then we have perpetual like this with the knight returning. Though white could also try rook to f7, and this is a perpetual as well. Takes, and whether black takes on f7 or plays king f8, either way, it's going to be a draw. If you go somewhere else, you can lose. So let's say king f8, queen f6. So we're threatening queen h8 check. If e4, defending it with the bishop on a1, don't forget about that guy. And also clearing the defense, or clearing an attack on the knight, but now white can regain the rook. It still might look a little scary with these passers, but the first one goes, and if d2, then queen to d7 check picks up the second one. And, okay, black could play a move like queen to e2, but then white's going to have perpetual check. So this will peter out into a draw, and in any case, white could have avoided this by just playing knight back to f6 check again. Also here, instead of king to f8, king to f7 is possible, but then it's an immediate perpetual like this. Okay, so yeah, the simplest was just to play knight f6 and repeat that way with a draw. Okay, so a very, very interesting and exciting game. Pity at the end there, but live and learn, and next time you get them. Okay, so now we're on to the viewer questions here. This was submitted by Kajetan, or Kajetan, I'm not sure how he wants to pronounce it. Anyways, a Class B player, and he writes this. So he says, my question concerns rook endings. I reached a 2-pawn up ending recently, and I thought this surely had to be easily winning. However, I had no clue as to how, and played like an idiot. I was also short on time, but if anything, that suggests that had I known the correct plan, I could have won easily. The only reason I didn't lose, and even won, was that my opponent apparently had no clue either. So in a pretty lousy display of random moves, I managed to pull it off pretty much by willpower. So here's the position, and he says winning, right? So I thought, okay, I used my rook to stop his passed pawn, and put my king in the center and use it to advance my own passed pawns. As it happened, he was way quicker. When I understood I wouldn't be able to stop the pawn, I felt obliged to sacrifice my rook for it, as I thought that the resulting king and 5 pawns versus king and rook and 2-pawn ending with my active king may have been objectively won for him, but it most certainly was a lot easier to play for me. From that point, I won without much of a fight, but I'm sure that's only because it was a contest of lack of skill between two guys who didn't know what they're doing. In other words, I'm so bad at rook endings that I have better results if I give up my rook and play a pawn ending for me versus a rook ending for my opponent. Note from my future opponents, if you find yourself in a rook endgame against me and I blunder my rook, don't take it. You'll have a much easier job if I keep it. My question is, can you say a few words about winning such endgames? What would be a general plan? What was wrong with my thinking? You have the ability to explain such things very clearly, so I'll be much obliged. Thanks in advance. Okay, well, that was a very funny introduction, so I definitely enjoyed that. And I would be a little bit more forgiving. I mean, I would say rook endings, despite the old saw about all rook endings being drawn, they're actually quite complicated. And, there's a lot of imbalances here. So I think your general approach isn't so bad. I don't think it was the best way to play it, but I think it was a reasonable idea. You see that this pawn is dangerous, and so at a certain point you just decide, yeah, I should just jettison, make him take as long as he can before he wins my rook, and then use my my herd of pawns, my gigantic pawn phalanx, going for counterplay. So I think that's a viable sort of strategy in general. Excuse me, in general. I don't know that it was the absolute best way to play here, but given time trouble and the difficulties in this ending, it's you don't have to flagellate too much in this case. All right. Well, in the game, Black played rook to b8, and this, I think, is already a step in the wrong direction. So it's understandable. I mean, it looks like it's going to take White quite a while to really push that pawn, and meanwhile, we've got this huge majority on the king side. Why not? Well, before we get to rook to b8, let's think about some other ideas. One idea that I think makes pretty good sense is to play rook c3. So this threatens the pawns on the third rank, and it prepares rook to b3. I mean, don't forget Tarash's basic rule. Rooks belong behind passed pawns. So why not go here? You could also play rook c1 check and rook to b1, but it's better to play rook to c3. I mean, the tempi work out about the same. Either way, when White's king gets to c2, it's going to attack the rook and force it off the b file. But here, at least, there's the threat to the kingside pawns. So let's see. King e2, rook to b3, and now White has a choice. He can either play rook to a8 and put his rook in front of the pawn and then try to drag the pawn forward a bit, or he can just bring his king straight over and sacrifice the pawns. So let's look at each plan. So rook a8 and then rook to b8. Well, now I think d5 makes sense. King d2, d4, king c2, rook c3 check. King b2, and now e5. So our pawns are just running straight up. f5, b6, and now king h6 is not a bad move. The idea is that when he plays b7, he's threatening rook to g8 check. So we'd like to be able to play rook to c7 here, because now there's no check, and now he's going to have to spend all the time playing king b3, b4, b5, b6. And after we move our rook, then he moves his rook, and so on. And only then is he threatening a queen. Meanwhile, we'll have played e4 and probably promoted our own pawn. So king h6 is not bad, but White has another little trick here. He can play rook to a8, threatening b7. So we have to play rook c6, or at least should. Now rook to a6, again threatening b7. So now we play rook to c8. All right, so let me give this an exclamation point. It's a good move. Rook c8. Okay, and now some choices. Kind of a funny move is h4, just trying to lock in the king a little bit. But king h5 is fine. Rook a7, king h4, rook h7, king g3. Let's say rook e7, and now rook to b8. And Black is going to have plenty of pawns left over when White is finished taking, enough to win. So this is winning for Black. Okay, let's try king b3 instead. So up comes the king. Well, now king g5. That's what h4 was designed to prevent. King b4, rook to b8, king c5, and now d3. Of course, if the king stays back, we play king f4, take the pawns, e3, f4, e3, and so on, and win easily. So either way, White is toast. So that's going back here to rook a8 check. Well, how about king d2? We just jettison these pawns and pray that the b pawn is just going to be too hard to stop. And the funny thing could be that Black has so many pawns that it's hard for his rook to get back. So after rook f3, king c2, rook h3, b5, and we can see all these, it'd be great for Black to have one fewer pawn somewhere, get rid of the f pawn or the h pawn, even the e pawn, then it would be an easy win. But the king covers the c file, the h through d files are all blocked by Black's own pawns, the king also covers the b file, and the rook covers the a file. But Black has just enough time, so rook h5, rook b4, again, rooks go behind passed pawns, rook c5 check, king b3, rook c8, b6, f5, and yeah, the 5-on-0 fast break here is going to be too much, and it's going to take White a long time just to win the rook. So this is no contest. So rook c3 is one perfectly good way to handle the position. We'll give it an exclamation point. Okay, another idea is to play rook c4, and this isn't bad either. So we're just going to annoy White by pinning the pawn here. Now if he plays king to e2, it's a very easy win. We just play king g7, and now the rook is stuck on a4, and after king d3, d5, The king can't come over either, so this is really, really easy. Unfortunately, white can play rook to a8 check and make it a bit tougher. So king g7, rook to b8, but still we're pretty happy here. f5, b5, and we can do whatever we want. Well, actually, that's not quite true. If rook to b4 here, I think this is not a very, very sensible move. Give it a question mark. Because it's letting white make some progress, and the rook is really not needed on b4 just yet. So king e2, say king f6, king d3, king e5, king c3, rook b1, and this is kind of annoying. So now he's got this little tick-tock going here, and while black is probably still winning, it's definitely not anywhere near as easy as we'd like it to be. So going back here, instead of rook to b4, let's just get the king going. King f6, king e2, king e5, king d3, again d5, very, very useful. The rook doesn't have to go to b6 to the b file until the last moment, not until b6 and b7 have been played, as long as the king is shielded from a check. If the king is subject to a check, then we need to go there when the pawn hits b6. But there isn't going to be any checks, so now we're just going to play king f4, e5, and well, either go g5, h5, g4, or just take on f3. I mean, lots of stuff. It's very, very easy at this point. So rook to c4 is another very good way to play. A way to play that's not so good, I think, is king f8, although this should win too. Just bringing the king straight over. b5, rook to b8. Okay, now if rook to b4, this I think is pretty easy. And the white king is not really getting over. The black king gets to c5, because king d4, e5 check. And this is simple. Rook to a5 I think is a bit tougher, which is kind of funny. I mean, it looks like the most idiotic square in the world for the rook, but the rook has nothing to do on b4. We want the king on b4, and the rook can operate from the side. Still, black should win without much difficulty here. And again, it's going to take quite a while to, quite a while to win to win the black rook. Excuse me. So if king to b4, e4, and the pawns are fully in flight here. So black should win in this case too. So while I don't like king to f8 as much, it's also pretty good. But rook to b8 I think is completely, well, yeah, it's a mistake. Though again, the general strategy, I mean, it makes sense, but taking this passive position makes it easy for white to get counterplay. Okay, king e2. And now, alright, if king f8, which wasn't played, again we can see that white is getting fairly quick here. So here's a variation where black can win, but this definitely was not what black had in mind. So it's a queen ending, so that's always going to be a pain in the neck. Black should win, probably without tremendous trouble, but yeah, this is just wrong. White should definitely not be allowed to get this far. Alright, instead of d5 check, could also play rook to b7, but still, this is really way too much counterplay. So king to f8 would be another poor move, I think. d5 is okay, though. So d5, and now either king to g7 or e5. I think both of these are okay. So for instance, e5. Alright, let's say he plays rook a5. Well, we certainly don't mind giving up a pawn or even two pawns to reach this. I mean, this is just dead one. Yeah, actually we're only giving up one pawn. And if king c3, well, e4, the pawns go, f5, and the white king can't help the b pawn and stop black's passers. So let's say if king to c5, then e3, rook a2, f4, and white's already pretty obviously lost. If h4, trying to stop black from getting the rest of the pawns going, well, we just activate the king now. And black is going to keep pushing white back at this point. So h6, g5, and the pawns will continue their advance, followed by g4, king g5, king f4, g3, etc. Okay, so that's one winning approach with just e5 and pushing the pawn. If king to g7, I think this is winning too. So king c3, for instance, king f6. Now, if rook a5, king e5, b5, king f4. Again, the king and then the pawns are going to be too fast. Or if rook a7, we just play e5. And black will push the e-pawn and force the white king to decide. So this is winning pretty easily too. Okay, in the game black played king to g7, which is okay. King d3, king f6, king c4. So I would have preferred, again, to have the pawn on d5 first, but this is also alright. And black can still win. with the usual means. So either d5 check, king c5. Okay, again, this is much more active than white deserves, but still, rook to c4. So this little trick slows white down a bit. And here you can just trade and play king d6. The king stops the pawn, and the 5-on-2 will win without any difficulty. Another winning move is king to e5. Say b5, d5 check, king b4, d4, and lo and behold, the black pawns are again ready to run. And if the king tries to help the b pawn by itself, we can just let it, and then play king d5, e5, e4, and the pawns win very easily. But unfortunately, black played rook to b7, so this is another kind of wasted move. In fact, the rook can become a little bit of a target there down the road. So this is, again, not so good. b5, king e5, and already at this point it's not clear that black is winning. Maybe white's best now is rook to a8, clearing the way for the king. So he's going to play king b4, a5, a6, and so on. And let's say if d5 check, trying to get his own play going, well, king c5, rook c7. Notice that the rook is, of course, closer. Well, okay, b6 is threatened, but yeah, this is a little bit funny. Okay, a bit of an abstract variation, but it seems that black is no longer winning here. All right, a lot of complications at this point, but the basic idea is that black's central pawns, or his big pawn mass, is not really going. Some of the pawns can be vulnerable. It's just not good. So rook to a3 was a bit needlessly passive here. Black should play maybe d5 check again, or f5. All right, h5 is not really the most threatening pawn to push. Okay, here white has some options too. Again, rook to e3 check is interesting. Could just play rook to a8 again, kind of like the line we saw before. And rook to b3 is probably not bad either, as played in the game. Actually, here, no, I take that back. There is one good way for black to proceed here. Only one good move. Where by good I mean giving black a winning advantage. Okay, well, let's look at some of the not quite as good options. So king f4 is sensible, trying to go for it, but I think white is in time. So b6, f5, king b5, d5, king c6, rook b8, king c7, rook f8, b7, e5, and now rook to b6 is a good move. So the threat is to play rook to d6. And once rook to d6 happens, then black can no longer win, because the threat's rook to d8, rook f7 check, rook d7, rook f8, rook d8, and so on. Well, we can see it here. King f3, rook to d6, d4. We're threatening the queen, so he's got to check. We block, and it's just a repetition draw. Okay, so black could play rook to f7 check and sack the rook. But it looks like white can hold here. Not win, but hold. So I think this is a draw. Alright, so we can see already, though, that nothing has gone well for black in this ending. Another try from here, instead of king f4, which is close but not quite good enough, is d5 check. Before that was a move we liked, but now it's not quite so good. King c5, okay, check, king d6, and then king a6. And the pawn's just going to go. Rook c4, b6, check, king b7. And yeah, black can hold up the advance of this b pawn, but then his pawns aren't going anywhere either. So this is at least unclear. I don't know if there's a win for white, for black in this position. Okay, finally, there's the right move. Well, there's also the move played in the game, which is rook c7 check. And this isn't good enough to win either. But rook to b6, this does win, I think. Okay. The point is, well, okay, if rook to d3, then rook to b8 now gains a tempo. And the rook is further back. So the fact that the rook is on c8 now rather than rook on c7 is going to give black some crucial tempi, and I think black can win here. Okay, well, in the game, rook c7 check, king b4, and now rook to b7 would just be a repetition. It would be equal. Yeah. But black played king to d4, which is okay. And now white has, I think, a couple of moves. No, only one move that's good. So the move he played, king a5, seems to be a mistake. He should have played b6, which is the natural move too. So rook to b7, king b5, rook b8, king c6, king c4. And here come the pawns, but again, black is, or white's very fast here. And now the king gets over to the king side and can start despoiling the black pawn structure. So e5, we take this guy, we're going to take some more guys, and after all the excitement comes to a conclusion. Remarkably, this is going to be a draw. So black is just saving himself here. I mean, it's very close to being lost, but he can hold in this way. After king a5, though, black can win with rook to a7 check. King b6, and now rook to a1. King c6, king c4. Okay, if rook to b2, then king c3, and the rook has to quit the b file, and that's going to give black enough time. So he'll play rook to b1, and then start pushing his pawns. Okay, what about b6? So I wonder about that. Probably just rook to a6 should be okay. Maybe there's something better, but anyway, b6 looks like an interesting try. Maybe that could give white some last chances. Anyway, d5 was played in the game, and now after b6, again, the position or the game should be a draw. Rook c8, b7, rook b8, and now white makes a very, very bad move. It's easy. Okay, let me put it this way. It's not necessarily so easy to calculate why it's a bad move, but fortunately, it's the kind of move that you don't have to calculate. You can just know immediately that it's a poor move. The choice is between king to a6 and king to b6. Which move should you make, or should white make? The answer is king to b6, and the reason is just that you don't get any. Well, two reasons. One is that king to a6 doesn't give you anything that king to b6 doesn't give you. So you can go to a7 next in either case. But by playing king to b6, you have the option of king to c7, and then the king is closer to black's pawns. So it just makes sense to bring the king where it's closer to the mass over there, and gives you a chance to save the game. So after king to a6, it's an easy win for black. Well, maybe that's a bit much, but actually I think, yeah, he does win cleanly after this. So, or relatively cleanly. King to b6 draws, though. So e5, as in the game, king c7, rook b7, e4, and now king to d6. E takes f3, and rook takes f7, and now it's black who has to scramble for the draw, though he does get it. So it's still a draw, but it's black who has to kind of wriggle a bit to achieve it. So you can see the king is great on d6, but in the game, after king a6, e5, king a7, now the king is just way out of the way. White can take either way, but neither way is going to save it. If he plays king b7, then e4, takes, rook b4, king d3, check here, and there's no perpetual. If the rook goes to e2, then king d3, and the pawn can start advancing. So the rook wasn't quite far enough away from the pawn for side checks to have any hope. It probably didn't anyway, but it certainly doesn't now. Okay, if rook takes b7, well, this is the game. Now f5. Here, if rook to b4 check, king to c5 is very good, helping to shoulder out the white king. And black wins. So there's no checks, and the white king has no easy path back to the black pawns, which is again why it was so important to play king b6 and then king c7 earlier. So rook to g7 happened, and here black makes a mistake. He plays king to e3. Maybe felt as if he'd be more secure by getting rid of all of the white pawns that he could, but this is a mistake. So the old adage about passed pawns are to be pushed really is relevant here. I mean, just push, and white has no chance. I mean, this is just going to win very easily. After king e3, it becomes a little bit more tricky. So king e3 is a mistake. Okay, if king b6, d4, rook e7, d3, black is still winning. So okay, white played rook g6, and now another serious mistake that throws away the win. Although it's already tough to win. The right move here is d4, but this is still a nightmare. Rook g5, king f4, rook h5, d3, rook h8, king f3, h4, and here come the pawns for both sides. And this is a table base win for black. It's mate in 54 if you can play like a computer or a table base. But the bad news is that we're not table bases, and it's a pain in the neck. Plus, white's king is more or less where it should be. It's, if you can't have the king in front of the pawn and a queen ending, generally the best place for it is in the corner, all the way on the opposite diagonal from the pawn. So this is pretty much ideal. An ideal defensive location for the white king. It's a real difficult ending to win, practically speaking. It's also lucky that black queen first, because if it was white to move queen h5, check would even win. Anyway, this was winning for black, objectively speaking, but not easily. After king takes f3, there's not even an objective win if white plays correctly, which is to get the king back into the game. So king b6, d4, king c5, d3, rook to d6, king to e2, and again white just has enough time to cross over here. King e5, e4, king e5. After d2, king f5, e3, king f4. So the white king grabs the pawn duo by the tail here, and after queening, in fact it's black who has to prove the draw. Whoops, sorry. It's not difficult, but still, it's up to black to prove the draw here, which is done like this. Okay, well, in the game, white played rook to g5, and now black is objectively winning again, although it's still not trivial. Here, again, with d4, we should have a table-based draw. I mean, a table-based win in the following variation, basically the same as the last one. So only very slightly different. Here, the black king is on f4 rather than on f3. So this time it's a table-based mate in 56 moves, not 54. So you got to work two further moves. Well, not to mention the extra moves you played getting here. So e3, though, was a mistake. And now, once again, white can draw cleanly with rook to d8. d4. Well, the thing is, if king to e4, then king b6, king c5, and the black king gets back quickly, or maybe he can even play h4. So either way, perhaps it's a draw. So d4 is best. Rook to d4, king e5, rook d8, f4, rook f8. Now e2, rook e8 check would win. So king e4, and here comes the white pawn. And this is obviously a dead draw. So white again could have saved the game, but white was never winning at least, so only drawing. Instead, fortunately, white played rook to e8, and now it's just lost. D4, h4, d3, rook d8, e2, and that was at least as far as the score went, but I guess the game went a little longer. But yeah, obviously black is winning. So a very difficult ending. I mean, yeah, black could have definitely played much better, but again, it's just a complicated position, and it just shows, I think, that rook endings are quite difficult. But going back to the beginning, I think the two basic strategies, one of putting the rook behind the pawn like this, would have been winning fairly easily, not trivially, but fairly easily. And then this pinning trick is also quite good. So if king e2, king g7, and it's just completely hopeless at this point for white. He can't do anything at all. Or if rook a8, okay, then we just start pushing all the pawns, and we only go to the b file when we absolutely have to, with an easy win. All right, very, very interesting rook ending, and hopefully instructive too. Okay, finally, the last question will involve no analysis. It's just all talk here. Okay, so this is from Nushutz, who submitted a game in last week's show, or for last week's show, and he says this. I returned to competitive chess last year after a short 35-year break. Yeah, that's a short break, all right. So he says, I'm following an improvement plan laid out by Wetzel in his book, or maybe it's Wetzel, I think he's a German guy, in his book, Chess Master at Any Age. I have a pretty good idea of what I need to do to improve in the middle game through the ending. I have taught my kids openings out of Sirwan's winning chess openings, and I have followed his opening advice on my return. Pierts, King's Indian attack, and defense. I have done very well as black, especially with the Pierts. I advanced in rating a little more rapidly than I thought I would. Now he's an A player. He was 14-19 way back 35 years ago. Anyway, he says, and I think I need to start replacing the King's Indian attack with something a little more challenging for black. My question is, how can I determine what my style is so that I can decide what variations to pick? how comfortable I am with a position is not a good guide, because I'm often very uncomfortable in the purest positions I reach, but I still do well with them. I guess they're even more uncomfortable for white. I know I need to start picking variations based on the kind of middle game plans I want, and also to better consider what the endgames will look like. Okay, so that's the end of the question there. Well, it depends on what you're trying to do. If you're trying to learn, I would say, play richer systems. So you can always play the main lines, play the Ruy Lopez with white, or play whatever it is. So mainline Sicilian, open Sicilian, the regular Ruy Lopez, and so on. So that, I think, is going to give you the richest experience and overall the greatest learning experience. All right, but depending on what you're trying to achieve in terms of results, if you want something a little quicker, you don't want to go in great depth, well, in that case, then you look for, again, I have to say, you look for lines that you think are ones where you feel comfortable, or where you think your opponents feel less comfortable, perhaps. But I would say, again, play positions that look attractive to you, that seem to fit with your comfort zone, and also with what strikes you as your style as best as you can tell. I mean, if you like complications, play complicated variations. If you like strategically complicated openings where the tension builds but doesn't necessarily resolve quickly, maybe you want to play D4 and play complicated things like the Catalan, for instance, where the tension can build and build and build. So it's really a matter of choice. Another thing you do is just play a bunch of things. Play a bunch of lines and look at a bunch of games and see what looks appealing. So just try lots of stuff and test it out. And you're also not obliged to choose an opening repertoire for the rest of your life. I mean, you can play something for 6 months, learn it as best as you can, move on to something else and work on that for 6 months. And you'll learn an awful lot that way. You become more dangerous. You become hard to prepare for. Things you learn from one system can sometimes be transported, at least partially, into other systems. So that would be my recommendation. So, the comfort idea, I think, is reasonable. I think it is a good guide. It's not the only guide, though. But I think there's something to be said for variety as well, and learning rich mainline systems, whether with one D4 or one E4 or again with black. So as you're getting up there, as you hit, you're an A player, I guess, and as you hit expert, definitely I think the more you know, in general, knowing at least something about many different variations, and knowing a lot about a few is the way to go, rather than to just specialize in a very narrow repertoire. Okay, so that's going to be it for this time. I think this show actually went a bit longer than the last one, even though there were, I think, fewer games and positions that we looked at. Perhaps they were richer, or at least I delved more deeply into what was available this time. Alrighty, so I will go in and close here. See you next week. Thanks a lot, and goodbye.